Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Effective Marketing to Women webinar presented by Linda McGregor of All About Eve. My name is Sarah Anderson, and I'm in charge of the AMI's communications and content. The first thing I'd like to do today is recognise the collaboration that's involved in these webinars with our partner Redback Conferencing. It's now my pleasure to introduce Linda McGregor. She's got over 25 years marketing experience across a broad range of categories, including alcohol, FMCG and financial services marketing and advertising, and it comes from all around the world. She's established All About Eve over 10 years ago to correct many of the myths about how to market successfully to women and to help clients actually understand the buying power that women hold. They actually make over 80% of consumer purchasing decisions. Linda and her fabulous team deliver insights into key gender differences impacting female behaviour and communication, and they've developed a holistic approach examining conscious and subconscious female attitudes, actions and impacts that you'll hear more about during the webinar today. As a pioneer in this area, we're grateful to have her insights today to help you all improve your understanding of and marketing to women. So thank you so much for making the time, Linda. Let's get started. Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. We've got about 45 to 50 minutes where we're going to talk. Might be a bit longer if we take questions as we go, but as Sarah already said, feel free to put questions in and we'll stop at various points so that she can actually cover that. Just to make sure that you're all with me and not asleep, we're actually going to start with a quick poll. If you could just bring that poll up for me, please. I think the question we all need to ask ourselves as marketers is, how well do you actually think you understand your female target audience? So if I could have some votes on that, please. We've got a bunch of things actually coming in now, so interesting in terms of how the poll's going. I'm just going to close that in the next couple of seconds. So no surprises there. The vast majority of you, nearly 60%, in fact it's just gone up, near to 65%, say you think probably 50% is probably where you're at in terms of understanding your female target audience. Not surprised, given that you're dialing into this webinar. Just over 30% of you think you don't actually know them very well or you don't understand them very well at all. And I think there's a brave person out there who says, yes, I think I understand my audience 100%. So we're going to see if we can challenge that a little bit for you as we go on. Okay, so mix of what's actually going on there. But here's the interesting thing, I think, for you guys as marketers. When you actually do surveys with women, and this has pretty much been done across the world in first world countries, and we've done the same here in Australia, 91%, a huge whopping 90% plus of women say advertisers don't understand them. So for those of you that said 100% you thought you understood your target audience, you're pretty outstanding if that's actually what you're managing to do. And fundamentally, if you're actually wanting to connect with your target audience, that's actually what we need to be concentrating on. Do you understand them? Because it's that understanding that will actually get you to a point where you're actually then able to connect to them and actually make sure that you're getting good feedback and good response from them. Okay, so let's actually start to explore that. How exactly do you get from knowing your audience on a fairly superficial level to really knowing your audience when it actually comes to women? We actually talk a lot about All About Eve in terms of both the conscious and the subconscious. And if you talk to neurologists, they'll tell you a very interesting statistic. When it actually comes to decision making, the last 5 to maximum 10% of your decision making is actually made in your conscious mind. So when you think about it, it's the final part of your decision making, but not a very large percentage of actually what goes on. The scary thing for us as marketers is 90 to even 95% of decision making processes are actually all made in the subconscious. Now let's just explore that for a couple of minutes. When we actually talk about the consciousness, we're actually talking about opinions and behaviors of women that they are conscious of. Now, when you think about what we do as marketers, most of the insights we look to pick up and the understanding we go with is actually around talking to women in terms of quant surveys and things like qual in terms of focus groups. So you're asking women what they think, and they're consciously answering you that. That is pretty much something like 90% of what most marketers do in terms of where they're gathering their insights to women. What most of us aren't doing and it would help if I'm going in the right direction. There's something about women in technology. What actually happens is the subconscious is something that we don't actually look into very much, and yet that is the autopilot that takes place in our brains that actually sets up and establishes beliefs, emotions, attitudes, and very importantly, behavior. And a lot of the time, if you ask men and women, they're not actually able to tell you the triggers that make them behave or act or believe the way that they do. So we talk a lot about All About Eve, unpacking the conscious insights that you get from qual and quant to get you to a point where you can then actually understand the trigger points and why women actually are doing what they do, in a way that you actually get to a point that you know your audience better than they consciously know themselves. So let's have an example of that. If we look at conscious insights, these are the sorts of things you would get if you worked in the automotive industry. A lot of stuff there. I won't go through it in terms of good news. Most people know a lot of those sorts of statistics. I will kind of tap into the first one. Over 85% of all purchase influence is actually either made by or by women in terms of making car decisions, even if they're not necessarily driving it. So some very interesting stuff that you get there from qual and quant. The stuff that we always obsess with as marketers is the bad news. And it's not a particularly good report card when you actually look at the automotive industry. What you actually find is a lot of women, over 50% of your target audience there, are saying they don't enjoy the experience that they have when they actually go to buy a car. They're finding, and there's our first huge difference that happens in subconscious behavior. What is actually going on there is almost half of women are offered offered a test drive as opposed to when actually men are in showrooms. And I'll come back and I'll touch on that one for you in a second. Whether it's true or not, most women that are actually in a showroom, for instance, feel very patronized by the way that they're actually treated. And interestingly, and this is an actual proven point, what we're actually finding is women end up paying more for a car in a lot of occasions than men actually do, but at the same time they're actually getting less for their money. So as a result, as a value package, not doing very well. So let's actually go, if that's what the conscious insights are about, what would you do with subconscious to actually unpack that? So there again on your right hand side is the sort of bad news that I just took you through. Let's actually look at how you'd unpack that. Why are these sorts of things actually happening? So first of all, part of the reason that women are reporting a bad buying experience is, interestingly, women hold a much higher level or expectation of customer service. So therefore, to get across the line with her is much harder. In terms of that horrible statistic around half women are offered test drives as opposed to men, a lot of that's to do with the fact that, and the figure is this, 97% of salespeople on the automotive side are actually males. They're fundamentally reading the behavior signs of their target audience, of the women in their showroom, incorrectly, and therefore think they're not actually interested in buying. And therefore, there's actually not that many offers then made for test drives. Carrying on, the patronizing, this is a classic one. Your salespeople there actually have unconscious or subconscious gender bias, and therefore, whilst they're trying really hard to actually build a relationship in the showroom with actually the women that are actually there to buy cars, they're actually not very good at understanding how to actually build that relationship. So as a result, and if you've been a woman buying a car, you'll have heard the, so tell me, what color of car are you looking for? Normally is your first question, when it may not be what your interest is. And then last but not least, in terms of proven to pay more, that's an interesting one. Most women actually have a very different attitude to negotiation as opposed to men. And as a result, they feel uncomfortable or feel they shouldn't have to earn a really good price on a car by how they actually negotiate in a showroom. So hopefully that starts to give you a little bit of an insight into some of the stuff that's actually going on in the subconscious that we're largely unaware of in terms of what we're actually doing as marketers.
Okay, so we have just reached our first pause for questions. If anyone has any, please feel free to type them in now. I have prepared one earlier. Linda, I'm wondering, do men and women have the same relationship of subconscious to conscious thinking that you mentioned in the iceberg slide?
Yeah, okay, so I talked about the consciousness in terms of decision making is about 5 to 10%, and the subconscious is 90 to 90%. That's pretty much a standard a standard statistic, say that after a drink or two, across both men and women. So actually, no, there isn't much difference in terms of the amount of conscious versus subconscious that men and women both use. But where it is different is actually how they put the pieces together. And from that point of view, it's actually far more female conscious insights that will help you unpack your female target audience.
Perfect. Okay, well, no one is typing, so I will keep you moving through because we've got a fair bit to go.
Look, not surprising. A lot of people I find with sessions like this are just taking some of the stuff on board. So I'm sure we'll get some more as we go along, or probably we'll sweep them all up at the end. Okay, so let's carry on then. If we explore the subconscious more, which is what I wanted to spend most of today doing, because that's the area that as marketers we're just not tapping into. If we look into that, one of the areas that we use as All About Eve is a proprietary tool or system that we call the fundamental four differences. And really quite simply, it works a bit like this. Whereas as men and women, there are a number of areas where we have huge similarities, there are also areas where we actually are fundamentally different, and hence the fundamental four differences when you are actually marketing to men versus women. Now, I'm actually going to take you through the four that you see on the screen there: values, communication, thinking and decision making, and all about how she manages her world. So let's start first with values. Interestingly, the scientific community have done a lot of work around this, and this is basically where we tap most of our information about the subconscious. We're actually looking and working with the scientific community around the areas of psychology, sociology, neurology, and even things like anthropology, you know, how cavemen days have actually shaped who we are. So the scientific community have done some very interesting worldwide research where they've actually looked at developed and undeveloped countries and actually looked at what the value sets were for men and women. Now, whilst there's a lot of overlap, there's also some areas where there's quite considerable differences. And obviously that's what we were interested in as All About Eve. Because we're talking about women, the value set as it is for women is what's up on the screen just now. So most women tend to be more focused on people, relationships, and connections overall. They tend to be very externally focused, and they tend to not only look at how their life is, but how other people around them are being affected. And there's very much a kind of interactive connection that actually goes there. Now, I'm being very black and white today because we've got limited time, so apologies to the boys if this next bit offends anyone, not the intention. But the value set from research that actually comes up when we actually talk about male values is interesting. It's much more around power and status than it is around people. And even from some of the group I have sitting here in the room today, I've got a few nods and a few smiles going at that. And yes, we have our representative male in the room as well. So let me kind of talk you through and unpack that a little bit for you. When you actually talk to men and women about sociability, it's equally important to all of them. But when you talk to guys about sociability, they tend to actually focus much more on things like social standing. So who do you know? Who do they know? How can you help each other get ahead? If you want an example of it, the classic is things like the Qantas lounge. You have to earn your way into the lounge. You don't just get in there because you're a nice person. Now, when you talk to women about sociability, they say a lot of the things that men do, but interestingly, they tend to be actually much more focused on what I'd call social support. So not necessarily who someone is and what their position is in terms of what they do as a job, but much more whether they're actually likely to support this person and actually be a genuine trusted friend and advisor. So quite different in terms of how the two of them work. There's a number of different things there that I would cover with if we had more time, but I'm going to jump onto kind of the big one that the anthropologists and the sociologists will talk to you about, and that's empathy. There's a very fundamental difference between the amount of empathy that you need to actually demonstrate with a woman to build a relationship than actually needs to happen between two men. So let me just give you an example of how that works. You would think, because of the business that I'm in, that I would have all this down pat. But like anyone else, I totally default to what my female DNA tells you or tells me to do. So here's my little story. Recently, my laptop ceased working, and given we're a small company, I had to go and find someone to fix it. So there I am going, what the hell am I going to do now? And off I toodle to find someone that had been recommended to me to fix my computer. Now, this is the kind of picture I had in my mind, that I'd have a bit of a discussion with the nice tech guy. He would listen to my story about what had happened to my computer, we'd chat a little bit back and forward, and then he'd tell me how he was going to fix my computer. The reality was a bit more like this. I ended up, despite the fact I was trying to tell myself not to, telling the guy what was wrong with my computer and why it happened and how I looked after my computer. He sat there looking totally, utterly bored until he finally went, yeah, that's great. It'll cost us $50. We'll run a diagnostic. I'll phone you in 2 days and tell you what's wrong. Now, interesting, not so much a judgment call on the guy, but it is a judgment call on how he was actually building trust and demonstrating empathy. Women need to show empathy and also receive empathy in order to actually start building trust in relationships. So in terms of my example, very low on building trust with me, as opposed to what I was looking for was something that actually did that. I therefore walked out the store with, as I felt, no choice but to leave my laptop there. But really, bottom line was, I felt I have no idea what they're going to do to my laptop and whether it'll even work when I get it back. So that starts to actually explain how some of these value sets are. And as brand marketers, what you need to think about is what are you actually doing in terms of the brand value set, and does it actually match your female target audience in order that you can start to build trust and connection. Okay, so let's just give you a quick example of that. Can we run the first video?
I'm not a fan of my belly. I try to hide it sometimes.
My complexion. Bad complexion.
My bum? Can I say that? That was horrible.
My thighs. I'm Irish, we have big thighs, we don't like them.
Oh, I'd like to lose 5 pounds.
My arms. I don't particularly like wearing sleeveless things.
My thighs, my stomach, my curly hair I don't love all the time.
I don't know.
Good question.
Trying to think.
Well,
I don't really have a favorite part of my body. No, nothing that I can think of.
This is so uncomfortable.
Nothing.
So as marketers, you're probably well aware of the work that Dove does. What you may not have thought about before is what it's actually tapping in terms of female subconscious, and in this case, values and the need for empathy. The brand actually is doing a really good job at bonding you with Dove as a brand by actually letting you see that you're not alone, that there's others like you that feel the same way about their beauty, about the way that their body looks. And as a result of actually being the person that's actually creating that platform and that discussion, they actually start to form some good trust bonds with you. So again, I'm sure you would have seen a lot of the Dove work before, but whether you actually analyzed and understood what they were doing from a subconscious or a psychological point of view, that's today what we're going to explore. So let's go on to fundamental for number 2, communication. It's really interesting. There's a number of statistics out there, but the one I find amusing is in a standard day, how many words women use versus how many words men use. And I can already see some smiles from around the room here and some nervous looks as well. This is what the scientists will tell you. In an average day, guys will use 8,000 words and women will use a whopping 20,000 words, so more than 2.5 times. What's interesting about that is, and for the males in the room, hold your kind of disbelief at this, it's not actually that we just like to talk more, it's actually that women use language differently. And this is a really important thing to understand as marketers. So when guys actually communicate and do a bit of bonding, what they largely do is actually not bonding, but information exchange. What do you know? Do you have the answer to my question? And on you go. When women communicate, whether it's personally or in a business environment, yes, they do that. But what we do is also what the scientists call twin tracking. At the same time, we're looking for lots of verbal and non-verbal communication cues around what are we actually doing in terms of are we forming a bond. So, for example, I don't know if you've noticed this, but feel free to watch this across the next week. If you actually meet a female kind of for the first time, you actually may make a comment to her if you're kind of not put on the spot, where you may go, and I'm now looking at Sarah here, I really like your necklace, that looks quite unusual. Now she's actually signing to me here going, oh, thank you. It is almost impossible as a woman to not have that sort of reaction to that sort of comment. But what normally then happens is there's a further part of the communication where she actually then tells me the story behind her necklace. And she's giving me a sign going, how the hell did you know that? That's what psychology does for you. So it's interesting. We actually have a different way of communicating as women where we actually need to form bonds, and we do it subconsciously. So watch in the next week and you'll see all this happening. Now, the question I have to you is, how do you use that sort of knowledge in terms of how you actually then put together and understand female versus male communication? So it goes a bit like this. When guys talk, there is this thing called the top dog. 4 men in a room, there will be one person leading the conversation. Females, 4 people in the room, there will be almost, I can almost guarantee you there will be at least 2 conversations going on, even if there's only 4 women. There'll be a lot of interrupting, but here's the difference. With the men, when there's interruption, it's someone challenging to take over top dog and control of the conversation. With the women, the interruption, which happens almost non-stop, is actually about supporting the comment that someone else has actually made, and actually is about forming bonds. Quite different then in terms of how that works. What you also get is a sort of thing where women will actually make that sort of compliment that I just did to Sarah, and there'll be a conversation that will start around, here's more that I have to tell you. It actually builds commonality. The difference with men, how do they build bonds? They take the piss out of each other. They actually use sarcasm. So very different. Now, if you think about how that actually impacts things that you do in terms of your comms campaigns, your copy, etc., then you need to understand those sorts of differences if you're actually going to get really true connective work actually happening in terms of what you've got. Now, I'm going to show you an example now of a video reference from the UK of Mulberry, and what it does really interestingly is it actually uses female humour, which is quite different to male humour, in order to actually connect you to the brand and make you feel closer to it. If we can run that, please.
That's really good on you. Thank you. Wow. Did you do that?
Yeah, it took me ages.
Look. Thank you. Merry Christmas, darling. Thank you, Mom. Oh. And he waves.
You ready for this? Wait. It's a unicorn.
Thank you. Thank you, Grandma. Shut up! ever!
We were all having to mute our voicemail or our voice here because we're all giggling away at this. So hopefully you were amused as well. The interesting thing again, when you actually look at the subconscious in this, and you'll have this to play afterwards, look at all the cues of subtlety in terms of the dynamics between the family. Very male behavior, lots of one-upmanship going. Granny's sitting there. Granny's not going to have a clue. Her present's going to be crap. It's going to be a knitted hat. And then lots of little looks between all of the members of the family. Then, and this is where all the humor works, all of that subtlety comes into play together at the end when in fact it's Granny that's actually been sitting there and has got the best present and actually wins hands down. Not dressed up, not looking smart or flash, but actually understood her granddaughter much better than the rest did. Bit of a wacky ad, especially for a luxury house, but one that was hugely successful for them. So I think at this point, it's probably time for us to see if there's any questions people want to ask.
Yep, that is correct. So I am not seeing anyone typing yet. This is your time, everyone. Again, following on from like the Mulberry video, we had sort of some visual communication, some not actual verbal communication. How about when women actually are talking, do they speak differently when they have, sorry, I can't even speak, when there are men and women in the same room? Does that actually change from the supportive conversation to a more one-upmanship kind of style like we saw in the Mulberry ad?
Yeah. Interesting question that you've got there. The answer to that is it can vary, but by and large, what happens, and again, boys, my apologies for this, I guess the way the psychologists and the neurologists would explain this is women tend to actually be more sophisticated in terms of the conversations they actually have. So when they're actually working and just talking with a bunch of other women, the whole idea of interrupting and lots of conversations going on at the same time, not a problem. What we actually do, and again, women, watch yourself on this in the next week, when we're actually then in a room where men are in the room with us, we actually default to a much simpler, less interruptive way of actually talking. Now, no one ever tells you this, but you actually just know that there's a different way that guys actually talk. And quite often in personal situations, you can actually be in a situation, barbecues are a classic, where you see genders actually splitting and the boys are all around the barbecue with the tongue master and the women are in another area. Sometimes that's simply down to commonality of what you want to talk about, but also commonality in terms of how you talk. And getting your head around that as marketers really helps you get really effective communication.
Oh, that's so true. That's so true. I'm really going to be looking out for that over the next week. All right, we have a question from Christine. From a marketing perspective, how do we easily garner an understanding of our female consumers' subconscious values? Is there an easy way to do that, first of all? And then how?
Well, you know, of course, I'm going to say the easy way to do that is to actually work with All About Eve, but that would be a bit of a cheat. Look, I'm going to cover that a little bit more as we go on, but the thing I would say to you is always challenge what you're getting in terms of research, in terms of insights, even if you're just doing a walk around your office and asking people what they think. See what actually has been told, what you've been told, and then actually think about what's behind that. Now, ideally, you want to get some basic understanding of the likes of psychology, etc. But to be honest, as long as you actually spend a bit of time thinking about it, you're likely to actually get to a point where you can wrap some of that into your thinking and your strategy formation, and it will work much better than if you just go on the basis of taking at face value what people are saying to you.
Okay, thank you. Just checking for any more questions. Christine has a follow-up question, I think. Give us 1 second while she types that out. All right. Oh, she's saying thank you. Okay, perfect. Let's keep going
Very polite,
with
Christine.
the rest of the presentation.
Okay, let's move on then. Number 3 of the fundamental 4, thinking and decision making. Great one here. I quite often, if I have more time, play a bit of a game where we actually ask men and women to actually vote on this question. So I'll kind of play a bit of it with you. Which is larger, the male brain or the female brain? You have a choice. Oh, that's got a few laughs going. The male brain is larger. the female brain is larger. They're both the same size. Should have done a poll on this. The answer is actually that the male brain is larger. I've got the male in the room here, kind of doing a bit of an air punch as we're actually talking here. He thinks he's just one. And it's actually larger, even making allowances for differences in body size. It's about 10% larger than female brains. Now, I'm looking at some of the stuff going on, and probably this is happening at your end too, in terms of some of the looks between the women, that knowing look that we do, which I can tell you, having done this a number of times, will translate pretty much to this. Well, they don't bloody well use that extra 10% very well. So that's all the sort of thing that's out there, political correctness and everything else. But let's actually get into the reality of differences. And Christine, these are the sorts of things that even with some of these basics that I'm teaching you today with the Fundamental 4, you can actually start applying some of this in terms of unpacking and understanding subconscious. So the female brain actually works differently from a male brain. We actually have far more ability to use both sides of our brain, the rational side and the more emotional side, at the same time. And therefore, as a result, women take on more information, cross-reference more information when they're making decisions, and actually have the ability to store information for later use much better than males do. So as a result, it actually means, neuroscientists call it this, women do what we call web thinking. We actually take on lots of information and we cross-reference it, a bit like joining the dots. Guys actually do something very different because of the construct of their brain. They take on a bunch of information, they then filter it, throw out all the stuff that they think is extraneous, and tend to work with a smaller amount of information in order to make their decisions. So from a marketing point of view, if we overload guys with information, it won't actually work in terms of communications. Funnily enough, as long as it's straightforward, you can flood women with much more information. And in fact, it's the sort of thing that works very well, especially from a digital point of view. So quite different in terms of how the two brains work. Web thinking as opposed to step thinking for males. The other thing, and hence why the visual here shows you a hand with 5 fingers there is this thing called the perfect answer. So I'll give you a couple of statistics here. Guys go to buy a pair of jeans. I can tell you from statistics that on average it will take them about 15 to 20 minutes to make that decision and make that purchase. I can tell you that women, on a good day, will take about 2.5 hours. So quite fundamentally different. What that's about is most guys are happy to make a good decision and move on to the next action or the next job. Most women are take much longer to actually do what we call due diligence. We'll take on much more information, we'll reconsider much more, and therefore as a result they are looking for what we call the perfect answer as opposed to a good answer. Now that sounds like that's not a big difference, and you probably think you don't do it very often. But it's absolutely been fundamentally shown that women will tend to shop longer and take longer to make decisions because they're always looking for this perfect answer. And that has a major impact in terms of what you actually do as marketers and how you use both your media and your creative work. Let me give you an example of this here. So to use cars again, because I wanted to carry on a theme here. The differences, for instance, between the two brains of the sexes is she web thinks, as I've just explained. That actually means it therefore means that she has more steps that she takes in the decision-making process, and each step, especially the research step, will actually take much longer. So for instance, and this is a big impact, think about how this might work in your category. When she enters a showroom, she's actually not ready to buy. She's actually still doing research and getting more information. So when we get that statistic from earlier that salespeople are frustrated that she's not actually trying to negotiate or she's trying to buy, it's because that's not actually where her brain's at yet in terms of the decision-making process. Now boys, I have to give you something positive. Interestingly, guys have superior spatial ability. So women have inferior spatial ability. Quite simply put, we are not as good at taking 2D and translating it into 3D. So for instance, when it comes to reading maps, women are not as good at reading maps as men are. They can learn to be, but it's an acquired skill as opposed to a natural skill. things like parking, all the jokes about women in reverse parking and why, you know, we've been told 6 inches is such as this sort of a length for years, are used in humour in terms of why women then can't park or reverse park, all these sorts of things. A lot of joking, a lot of good stuff there, but when you think about it, what it actually means is women actually then understand better if they actually get to feel, sense, see, touch for themselves, and no different with cars. So if you actually think about when she goes into a showroom, one of the big goals for her is to sit in the car, to feel what it is actually like. And there's our statistic from earlier and why it shocked me so much. Given only 41% of women are getting test drives, that's actually not allowing her an experiential activity, which is really important to moving her on the decision making. So these are the sorts of things that happen. Big question to you guys as marketers. The difference in the brain impacts both your creative and your media messages and your timing. How long after you've actually run a campaign before she actually takes action on it? She might not take action for some time. She'll simply store the information, but it will be there and she'll use it at a later stage. In terms of spatial ability, it impacts how you actually put together the elements of your campaign. And making sure experiential is there in some way, or use of video rather than necessarily print, are the sorts of things that will really help you get ahead. So let me give you a bit of an example, sticking to the car theme, of how you actually use the thinking and decision-making process and understanding that with women to actually put together a TVC that works a little bit differently.
Usually cars are reviewed by professional critics at big magazines, but today it's my turn. I'm Louise Eddy and this is my review of the all-new Honda Odyssey. Being a mum and also a musician, throwing open those dual-powered doors felt just as rock and roll at the school gate as it did arriving at my gig. The Odyssey comfortably transports the kids, their friends or grandparents, and has enough cargo space for scooters, boogie boards and a pram or 3. The smart parking assist and multi-view camera was my favourite feature. No more curb mountings in front of crowded cafes while attempting that tricky parallel park. And if you think a car with 7 seats goes through fuel like bottles of Shardy on a girls' weekend, you'd be wrong. Fuel economy is impressive. As a family, we're looking for space, comfort, agility and tech smarts, all in one sexy package. And this is the perfect fit. I'm Louise Eddy, Australia's newest car critic, and I give the Honda Odyssey 5 stars.
So interestingly, this little TVC, which is not very long, actually covers a couple of our fundamentals here. One, in terms of how women communicate. You might have noticed through it, you know, and the comment on, you know, goes through more bottles than Shardy on a girls' night out, is classic of using the audience's language to actually connect bonds, or to connect and build bonds with them. At the same time, that thinking process and the decision-making process that I actually talked about, she ticks off a lot of the things that you would in a traditional ad around a car, but in a very, very different way. So instead of, for instance, talking about features, she talks more about benefits. And the example of the parking is a classic one, which actually goes to how women actually think differently, how they might have things different on their list in terms of what makes a good car for them. So they are the sorts of things that we put into play. Okay, on to our last of the 4, managing her world. It's interesting, if you think about some of the stuff that we've been talking about, then actually you get one simple word that tends to sum up what women want, and that simple word is more. Everything that men want and more. Everything they had before and more. More takes more time. At the same time as that, you've got women who, because they're externally focused, as I explained in values, tend to be the social organizers in terms of groups of people. Add the two of them together and she tends to have genuinely a lot less time than she would actually like. So if you ask anyone if they're time poor, men and women will both tell you it. The reality is women definitely have less time. But interestingly, of their own volition, whether they realize it or not, whether we realize it or not, as women we simply take on more, do more, and therefore we have to get bloody good at actually being able to multitask. Now, people talk a lot about multitasking. At All About Eve, we actually talk about maxi-tasking. which I can demonstrate to you probably best through my simple bowl of cornflakes example. So someone goes out, male this morning, and kind of goes to get his cornflakes, opens the fridge, damn it, there's no milk left. Now this is pretty much what he would do. Jump in the car, head up to the nearest shop, grab his bottle of milk, be back down in 5-10 minutes, pour it on his cornflakes, happy as Larry. Same thing happens with Sarah this morning. Sarah goes to get her cornflakes. Damn it, no milk. Really want some cornflakes. Jumps in the car, nips up to the corner store. Oh, since I'm here, might as well just pick up a couple of other things. Now, I can see you're all laughing, but that is the reality of how we work as women. And that is what maxi-tasking is all about. It's not about juggling lots of things at one time, or not just about that, but it's getting the most out of the least amount of effort. And therefore we cross-reference. To the women listening in on this, I'll give you a tip. If you have a male partner who's going to the likes of Bunnings at the weekend and says, honey, is there anything else you want me to get? The correct answer is no. The answer you will give is, oh yeah, can you get me this, this, this? And then you're going to wonder why he's really grumpy when he comes back in 40 minutes instead of the 5-10 minutes quick trip that he planned to do. So, quite a difference between multitasking, which is juggling tasks, and maxi-tasking, getting the most out of every time you do an activity. So let me just actually throw that one into an example again, so we can keep moving on. There's a great little example from OPSM where what they've actually done for mums in particular is combine the idea of reading to your kids at night with actually testing their eyes. So if we can run that last video, please.
There's nothing more precious than your child's eyes. But 1 in 6 Australian children have a vision problem. So OPSM has created Penny the Pirate, a free storybook which allows you to screen their vision as you read to them. Download the free tablet app or pick up your copy at any OPSM store. Make sure you trust your child's eye health with us, because OPSM loves eyes.
So a great example of, busy parents, but mums in particular, not having time to take their kids along and get their eyes tested. This is a really simple way to actually test your kids at home, and they don't even know that you're doing it. That would be classic maxi-tasking for women, and that's the sort of things that really successful brands do well. They make it easy for her, or easier for her, to do the right things and to do them faster and with a lot more ease. So we're going to take one more set of questions here, if there's anything, before we go on to some examples of how this all works in strategy and execution.
Yeah. Okay. So we have one question from Robin. She would like to know how what the impact is of all of the subconscious and conscious cues and the behavior, so the way that women and men's behavior changes when it comes to online shopping. How can you maximize your, I don't know, optimize your site for women, I guess. Is that possible?
Yep. Wow, that's a whole webinar in its own right. That's a really good question that you're asking there. Instead of trying to cover it now, I think what we might do, I know AMI are actually going to send some stuff out to you afterwards. So I think we'll come back with some key bullet points for you on that. The main thing I will say just now is really the rules that apply in terms of how she shops online and offline are actually fundamentally the same in terms of understanding her subconscious. What you really want to do is to understand what are the triggers, what are her needs that are actually getting her to shop in the first place. Now, you can pretty quickly start to answer some of these questions around subconscious. I've just explained about, for instance, managing her world and maxi-tasking. Think about the convenience of shopping. But against that, think about some of the things that I told you about, for instance, perfect answer. So, women like to actually do due diligence and feel stuff and try stuff on. And how do you actually get over that problem when you actually have a site that is dedicated to online shopping? So, look, I'll come back and answer that in more detail because there's so many angles to it, but great question.
Okay, no problem. We will send that out with all the slides and the recording when we've got that done. Lewis would like to know, he's got a pretty specific question here. How could the NRL engage more effectively with women? That might be a chat to Linda afterwards question, but is there anything you could tell us now?
Absolutely. Look, that will be a chat to Linda, which I'm very happy to do. But interestingly, I don't know if you've been looking at some of the stuff that's actually been going on around the world, both in terms of empowerment of women, in terms of confidence, etc. And also, particularly in the UK, they've done some very interesting work recently about women in sport. Now, a couple of quick insights. What they find is once girls get slightly older, get into their mid-teens, they get very body self-conscious. There is a lack of confidence, and quite often they actually walk away from sport. What they've actually done in the UK is actually run some very interesting commercials, which was all around, and part of a fuller campaign, but was all around you know, I am woman, but I get dirty and I'm strong and all that sort of stuff. So lots of great examples out there that we can definitely learn from and absolutely apply to the NLF, and FL even. But yeah, let's do that as an offline conversation because there's a few interesting angles on that. But the main thing I would say is if you look at the general movement right now to empower women, in particular young girls, through the work that Dove's doing and a lot of other brands out there, then there's some very interesting trends in terms of empowerment of and confidence of women that you can tap into.
Yeah, I would really recommend having a look at that campaign. I'll see if I can find the links. I actually watched it last night.
We've actually, if you go to the All About Eve website and you go to newsletter, there is actually in the archives an article that we wrote probably about 2 months ago now, which has actually got a write-up on that and some other work around sport.
Perfect. All right, I'll include that in the send out. One final question. Do all segments of women's have the same sort of brains? So I've got two specific parts, two specific sort of sections of women to ask about. What about mums? Because I can imagine they would be maybe a little bit different. And what about homosexual people? Do they also have the same brains?
Oh, that's two very interesting questions. So again, I could do a webinar on both of them, so I'll answer them as quickly and simply as I can. When it comes to mums, when you actually get pregnant, you go through a process called neurogenesis, which is your body actually floods, or your system is flooded in your body with three main types of hormones that in effect rewire your brain. So all women have the same brain, but all mums have an added, if you want to call it upgraded version of all of the brains that we have as women. So as a result, you go from being a non-mum to a mum, and some of the things that you used to love, you will no longer love the same way because your brain has been rewired and you have different preferences. Now, people talk about it a lot in terms of, oh, that's because of how society expects you to act and the responsibility you have as mum. Some of that, but actually the fundamental majority of it is that your brain now operates a different way and has different priorities, and your body reprogrammed it without even asking you to make you a better mum. So there's the first one, and the quick answer in terms of gays and lesbians is just because you're gay or lesbian doesn't mean that you're less female or less male. And the best one I can explain that to you is a little statistic. Unbeknownst to most people, 15% of males have a brain that is actually more wired like a female brain, and 10% of women, and I would probably be one of those, have brains that are actually wired more like male brains. So as you can see, the mass market is still very much acting as you would expect them to. Now, what I get a lot of the time then is, oh, okay, so if I've got a male that's got a female wired brain, then he'll be gay. Absolutely not. Your sexual preference has got nothing to do with how your brain operates. So very different in terms of how the two are.
Okay, cool. All right, well, let's move on because we're getting close to the end. I can't see anyone else typing, but continue to come in with your questions and we'll finish them off at the end.
Okay, we're going to do a bit of a rush to get all these questions finished, or all these extra slides finished before we wrap up. So let's get on to the hows. We've talked a lot about why women's brains are different, why we act differently, what are the fundamental fours. Now actually let's talk about, I guess, some of Christine's question earlier, so you were ahead of the game, Christine, was how do you apply all this sort of thinking in order to connect with her and to influence her better? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're all looking to do. Quite simply put, if you think about that example I gave you, and this is the same one again, think about how you can actually do that unpack. So get your good news, get your bad news, and then actually start to think about what's actually behind that. Better still, bring in some experts like us to actually do that sort of stuff for you. But that is the best way to, first of all, make sure that you've got a really robust and deep and wide set of insights about your audience. Now, having done that, let's actually talk about strategy. You get your insight, you unpack it. How do you get to strategic implications? Now, I've tried to keep it simple today. We've talked a couple of times about automotive, and I did that on purpose. From the sorts of insights that I've even just talked you through today, here's the sorts of strategic directionals that you would get. First of all, we need to really think about and focus on relationship, service, and follow-up with women. And one of the things is the category is kind of tarred with a bad brush. So one of the best things you could do in terms of strategy is think about how do you make your brand stand apart from and aside from the industry. How do you actually do things to actually show and demonstrate that you understand the dynamics of how women build relationships, what they think is good service. Secondly, and we've talked about this a lot, engage on her terms, not on your terms. One of the things we see brands do all the time is take the lead and talk about what's important to them in their language. What you need to be doing is to actually use your insights, understand what she needs and how to talk to her in her language. And again, the Honda example was a good one. Get to the point where she has what we call, that's interesting moments, and use that and what you actually do in terms of follow through to actually demonstrate you do understand. A lot of brands fall into what we call the lots of talk but not very much walk syndrome. So you say all the right things in your comms, but when she comes to actually experience the brand, especially if it's a service brand, then the two actually don't match up and it feels like you've actually got a schizophrenic brand. So think that one through and then actually walk through the process of what her decision steps are, and that's a really good way to actually then sort your insights as well. Okay, next thing. So we've got insight, we've got unpacking, we've got some strategy. How do we execute it? And I'm going to give you one quick example here. It's a piece of print, but it was the easiest way to actually show you how to do it and not do it. We're going to start with the before. I think anyone that saw this in a magazine of choice would go, oh my God, that's kind of a bit scary as an ad, and just move on to the next page. Now, actually, it was an advertorial. And again, there's a whole webinar on how to use ads versus advertorials. But for today, let's just look at that ad. Not something that's very welcoming. You know, you've got glowering faces, as we'd say in Scotland, looking at you, and really heavy red, white and blue in a really heavy piece of copy that's actually sitting there. So just really hard to get into. If you did some work on this, this is the sort of stuff that you'd actually end up doing in terms of how you made it look. And believe it or not, it's actually not dissimilar content. So first of all, some of the basics. You know, we'd use blue because it slows her pace down. From being frantic to you know the feeling that a sky has on you. Very simply the same sort of thing here. Radiates positivity. And what we've actually done now is we've done what they call chunking visually. So we've actually gone and actually had, if you work this out, there's about 4 or 5 different chunks of visual that actually work in this. And that actually works along with how female brains work. So there's lots of information, but it's in bite-sized chunks with space in between to allow her to think and cross-reference. And then also we've got in here a bunch of facts and also a bunch of emotional or opinions, which actually in terms of how females make decisions is a perfect balance of the two. So there's your starting point. Build on that. Headlines. you use the headline to emphasize what is possible rather than what is not possible or what might make her feel guilty, and then use the subhead to actually do things like what we call invitational language to pull her into the conversation, get her intrigued, make her want to read more. You actually then would look at doing a couple of things in terms of the advice that she's given. So actually up on the top right hand side we've got classic expert advice, but done in a very approachable way, very nice smiling female face we've got there, who is a doctor. But down the bottom in the middle we've actually got what we call people like me, from the office in this case of the magazine, who are just giving their opinion. So the balance of the two is actually quite an effective way to actually work with women in terms of this. And then last but not least, that kind of panel of white at the side with the block of red that got 10 minutes down the bottom does a whole load of stuff in terms of saying, we're going to give you a bunch of information here, but it's to help you, not to sell at you. And therefore it gives her control of what she finds of interest and what she feels she needs to work with. Down the bottom, we reinforce that with things like self-assessment, where she can actually go do a quick survey and actually find out for herself. And that does a bit of personal tailoring to her particular needs. So very different in terms of how these two look. Just to give you another back to, that was the, oh, excuse me, that was the old one. That's the new one. So not actually that difficult if you know what you're doing to actually have a very different opinion and very different feel to it. So look, I'm going to wrap up at that. We're 2 minutes to go, so we pretty much squeezed in there. Here's the 4 things that I would sort of sum up for you. The first thing to do is to think about awakenings. So what are you actually doing to actually, as a marketer, understand your target audience and some of her dynamics better before you even go looking for insights? Get that on board, and then you're actually in a good place to do some really good insights. Go get your insights. Do them, look at subconscious and look at conscious. Use them together to do number 3, which is unpack. Don't just have insights. Understand how it helps you understand your target audience, and therefore what your brand offer and going in point should actually be to make that what we call perfect fit connection. Last but not least, you've got all of that on the table. Use that. One of the things that we do with our clients all the time is we go in and, having actually pulled all that work together in stages 1 through to 3, we actually work with them on brainstorming sessions, on developing up ideas in terms of how this might look, how this might feel, and ultimately how you might execute it. So that's pretty much the wrap up for me. I know Sarah's got a few things to say before we finish, but thank you for your time so far.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda. Okay, so if there are any final questions, please start typing them in now. If we do run out of time, then we'll send out the Q&A as promised. There's a survey on your screen. Please, could you fill that in? Really appreciate your feedback, and we'll use that to improve our webinars in the future.
And if I can just jump in there and say, can you make sure that you opt in and say, yes, you would like the All About Eve newsletter, and that way we can actually make sure that we're sending stuff out to you to top up on today's seminar all the time.
But no pressure. And then, yeah, so I've got, Russell said more ladies than men on the call. Is there anything in that?
Sorry, say that again?
We've got a massive gender imbalance. We've got about, oh, you can't actually see, can you? We've got about 4 or 5 men and the rest are women. So
listening to the seminar,
at least 75% women. Is that because women are trying to better empathize and communicate with women because they care about women sort of a bit more?
One of the things,
without sort of leading you.
No, not at all. One of the things that we find, because we go out doing sessions like this all the time, what we find is, and it's a difficult one, the guys in the room tend to actually be the better audience, because most of them come along going, I don't bloody understand women most of the time, and therefore very open-minded, very prepared to say, okay, give me a checklist, tell me what I need to do when I'm actually trying to market effectively to women. What we find, not always, but hopefully what our seminars like this help the women in the room do, is most of them come along and go, oh, this is great, I want to hear more about marketing to women. But actually, whether they're aware of it or not, again, the subconscious, quite often they come along thinking, well, I'm a woman, So I know women. So quite often, some of the things that we're actually talking about in the room can actually be quite challenging and can be different from their opinion of what might work and what goes on. Because whether you're male or whether you're female, most of us are not very good at being very self-aware. And so what we find as a result is we get a lot more participation from men than we do from women in terms of surveys, questions at the end, etc. Because the women are actually quite often trying to recalibrate some of the stuff that we've actually talked about. What interestingly happens, and we'll see if it happens with you guys, is I tend to then get lots more from the women 24 to 48 hours later in terms of a truckload of questions because they've gone through their thinking process probably in a more holistic way, but just not had questions necessarily at the time on the spot because they've actually wanted to consider a bit more before they ask.
Sure. Well, if there are any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to direct them to either Linda, her email address will be up on the screen, or to me directly at editor@ami.org.au. I've got one final question here. What happens if I don't have the budget to run a separate campaign for women? What should I do?
Yeah, we get asked that a lot. I think the thing that most people misunderstand is that if you kind of have some sort of sense of what are the triggers for women versus what are the triggers for men, it's perfectly possible to actually run one campaign that actually can talk almost at one level to the men in the room or the men in the marketplace and actually talk differently to the women in the room. Digital is particularly good at this. So for instance, to the thought that was there earlier about websites, etc., you can have a bunch of things that are real kind of top line, just give me the bullet points that I need. That will work really well with your male target audience. What will happen, particularly on the digital front in things like drop downs, etc., women then have the ability to go, oh, that's interesting. Don't give me less information, give me more information, tell me more. And so you can actually have the same website with the same pages, but you've got functionality that actually allow women to do what I said was the one word sum up, more, and therefore they'll actually use that opportunity. The difference and the thing to consider with all of this is give her the opportunity to decide if she wants more rather than actually flooding her with more. That's really where the marketers who do well do best.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I've been nodding my head this whole presentation. I've learnt a lot. I'm sort of understanding myself. So that's been great. Thank you to everyone on the webinar for taking the time out of your day, and a massive thank you, Linda, for sharing your insights. We here at the AMI really hope this session has advanced your thinking, and please jump onto our website to see what's going on in your state. We do have quite a lot of events and workshops going on at the moment in addition to our webinar series. So we'd love to see you at a physical event sometime soon. Thanks again for joining.